Welcome to Dev Bootcamp Live, the podcast where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job, and we help you level up so you become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter. And today we're going to be talking about an interesting topic that's going to be relevant to any front-end engineer. We noticed as instructors at our respective boot camps that there's certain issues with front-end engineers of building a really great website. One problem I think a lot of us experience is when you're trying to load a web page and you maybe go click on a button, but it's still loading, and then a little ad pops down, and then you accidentally click the ad, right? That's really frustrating. Or maybe the web page is just taking too long to load. So this week, Juan is bringing the topic to help solve some of these issues. Juan, what's the topic this week?
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about something that was launched not too long ago. I think it was in 2020. It's a new initiative that was launched by Google. So it's called the Core Web Vitals. And the Core Web Vitals, it's an initiative by Google that aims to provide guidance to measure some specific quality signals that every website ideally should have. Like you have a good score if we want to mention that it has some sort of scoring system. So then it ensures that it has a good quality and a good a good user experience, really, a good experience for the user. So the thing is that usually when it comes to performance and improving your applications, it can be complicated. I mean, becoming an expert on web performance is really hard when you're a new bootcamp graduate, right? So this guidance is kind of like, hey, these are the things you need to keep in mind. This is how you do it. This is the tooling. So it's all the things you need to know. So then your site is performance. Why is this an issue? Because Jared, you and I or anybody in the world, when you visit a website, if you could get a blank screen and it takes 3-4 seconds, you probably go visit the second website, right? Or the second result. Like nobody waits. People are impatient these days because we're spoiled by technology. We have fast connections and 5G now that everybody's talking about and all this stuff. So of course we have to keep up. And as front-end engineers, we have the responsibility of building performant applications that load fast and that deliver to our users a great user experience. So Core Web Vitals is what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, no, it's a really important topic to consider and to think about. Why don't we jump in here? To give a high level kind of introduction to the Core Web Vitals, again, these are kind of a set of guidelines that Google has created to honestly make the web better. And although it's created and pushed by Google, this is applicable to any website on the internet. It has nothing to do with whether or not you use Google Chrome or services or anything like that. So there's three primary aspects to the Core Web Vitals. The first one has to do with loading. So kind of how fast does the page load? And we'll get more into specific details here. But the second one is about interactivity. So this has to do with when you're loading a web page, how soon can you actually click on something and have it actually respond correctly? And then lastly, there's something called visual stability, which is, when a web page is loading and all these different things are coming in, things can kind of jump around and move around, and it's just not a very good experience. So now that we've kind of touched the three aspects, let's go back through and talk about each of them. So the first one, loading. Juan, so in the loading world, what's like the primary metric that the Core Web Vitals talks about?
Yeah, that one is the contentful paint. I think LCP. Well, I don't know. Do you remember what it stands for? The largest contentful paint. Yeah. And really what it means is just this metric. So remember something very important. I said that these are quality signals, right? We said that they're quality signals. So everything is measurable, and it's measurable from a real world perspective, real world experience, right? Like the user can measure this, of course, or you can measure this as an engineer. So because it's measurable, everything has a score, everything has a number. And that's important to define right now when it comes to these three main metrics, three main items that we're going to be talking about. So that first one for the loading, the metric is known as LCP, so largest contentful paint, yeah, and that just is it just defines, or it just measures how quickly the page loads. And but it's not just about loading. Like we still have other metrics, and we can talk about those, Jared. But for example, if you use Lighthouse, or if you have used other tools that provide some sort of metrics like like speed index and things that we used to talk before like a few years ago. But now with this one it focuses not only on how quickly we render something in the page, but also like how quickly we render something in the page that is meaningful to the user. So that's very important to distinguish, because it's not the same. Like, for example, if I put a loading spinner, right, or a loading page, and it's kind of like, oh, cool, now I met this metric, is loading fast, right? But it has to be like meaningful to the user. So that's very important. So if you just throw a loading spinner, that's not relevant for the user. Why? Because if you get as a user a loading spinner for 10 seconds, you're not going to wait. You're probably going to be like, go back and go to the next site that is actually meeting these core vitals, web core vitals, and it's going to just visit and become maybe a user to that other competing app, right? Or website or web app, whatever whatever that is on the web. So Jared, for this one, what is like, because we talk about measurement. So how do we measure these? What is the unit to measure the largest contentful paint? What is the threshold? Like how fast a page should be? Like and what is acceptable after what amount of like that unit we should improve it? Like let's talk about those, Jared.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the largest contentful paint, and again, we're talking about meaningful content that's actually relevant to the user. The Google Core Web Vitals suggests that in order for it to be considered good, it needs to be less than 2.5 seconds. Uh, Between 2.5 seconds and 4 seconds, it's considered that it needs improvement, and then anything above 4 seconds is considered poor. And you'd be lucky to have any visitors to your website stick around if it takes up to 4 seconds for all of the content or even the largest content to be loaded.
Exactly. And if you think about like 4 seconds, it doesn't seem so much, but it's like it's not that much time that you have to render the most like these contentful paint. Of course, there's techniques and there's things that like anybody listening, you have homework with us always, so you gotta listen. Like, how can you optimize things? But for example, there's something called the viewport, and this viewport is like whatever you have available on the screen of the page. Imagine your page is 20 pages long, or your site or your app, but just what the user sees is what is relevant. So some optimizations techniques is just like, hey, just render what the user says first, and then lazy or defer the loading of everything else that goes after, or defer the loading of embedded videos because they're more resource intensive, and then just load images placeholders instead, or stuff like that. So those are like various techniques that help you meet that, so you don't throw a loading spinner. An empty state, those are very popular. The empty states, right? Like it seems like the component is loading, but it's not the component. Maybe it's a shade, right? Those actually help. Is better than a loading spinner. But the main content that the user is interested in, that's what it has to be loaded before 4 seconds, but 2.5 seconds is the ideal. And if you visit any Google website or any Google app or any Facebook app, if you notice, like in the website, you go to facebook.com or google.com or Gmail, you see that everything loads really fast, and you see that under 4 seconds they are already interactive and you can already work with the page. So that's a very important metric, but we don't want to confuse it with the with the with the first render. That's something that we used to measure before, like the time to provide the first meaningful render. But it's not just that now. It has to, because remember, like it's not just rendering something and the speed index. So speed index is not relevant anymore. But now these largest contentful
Yeah.
paint.
Yeah, and like you're saying, I mean, oftentimes the largest contentful paint is usually an image or a video on many different websites. So when you are dealing with that type of content, it's really important that you have that content be optimized in many ways. So Juan already mentioned lazy loading. So the idea of if there's an image off of the screen, don't load it until the user actually scrolls down. Or another thing is making sure that all of the images that you have, you've optimized them, right? You've compressed them by a certain amount to be appropriate for use on the web. There's lots of online optimizers. There's even optimizers built into both Windows and Mac. Uh, and in addition to that, there's also other aspects of optimizing this largest contentful paint. There's ways of optimizing the CSS that you're using to only have the CSS that's necessary for that, what's on the screen, and also for your JavaScript scripts. There's times where you can defer certain actions until after that first load happens, and then you're going to offer a much better user experience
And
to your users.
there's like in if you use Chrome for your development, if you go to the Dev Tools, there's a performance tab there that you can visit, and then you can run performance audits. Get very familiar with those. But once you get familiar with those, you will see with those performance audits, you'll be able to identify um, long running tasks. They will appear in red. You will be able to identify skip frames. But most importantly, when you run those reports, you're going to be able to measure and see like the scripting time. Usually, when it comes to web applications, let's say you're using React, the scripting time, how long it takes the application to bootstrap, that's usually one of the ones that is going to affect your largest contentful pain. Because if you have a lot of scripts being processed, a giant vendor bundle, right? You have a ton of libraries, not tree shaking, like all these different things. You're not lazy loading routes. Then that scripting time, no matter how fast that first page you have it is, until the scripting time is not done, is not gonna render. And if your scripting time takes 2 seconds, then you have just half a second to actually render, and that's not enough. Something important about the largest contentful paint, the LCP, this metric measures the largest piece of text or the block text or image that the user sees. So the first thing the user sees on the screen, right? So remember the viewport, whatever you see above the fold, what you see on the screen, right? If the page is long, and it measures like whatever is largest there. So if it is a big piece of text or a large image, and it just to keep things simple, like Google wants to keep things simple so then we don't have to struggle or become experts in web performance. There's only three tags that these measures really. So it's the img tag, right, when it comes to images, and also the image tag that is inside SVGs. So those are like the three tags I think. Am I missing? And the video task, of course, the video tags, because the video, videos are resource intense. So if you have a video tag and it's the first thing the user sees, maybe your page won't be so meaningful so quick because it takes some time to start a video player. So keep those things in mind, and that's all I have to say really about that metric. I mean, there's a lot of information we throw out there. You better be taking
Yeah.
notes if you're listening, and the performance tab, like there's all these different things we just mentioned, and we just mentioning just one of the three metrics, right? So
Yeah,
yeah, I don't know, do you
definitely. Yeah,
have anything else to add to that?
the last thing I would add about that is, you know, as you go on building your website and, if it gets, some more traction by more users and things like that, there's an additional optimization that you can make with images by using an image CDN. And when you're using a specific image CDN, what it does is when you upload an image to it, it's going to automatically generate multiple different sizes of those images and multiple different formats for those images in order to ultimately serve up the correct one to the user that's going to be best for their device and their bandwidth and whatnot.
Oh
So
yeah, that, and it won't look like shrunk. Like, have you ever opened a giant image in a little screen and it looks like all like distortioned, right, or pixelated, right? So it actually helps with that. Another one that I have used, Jared, is tiny PNGs, service online, and you grab any PNG you have, and what it does is remove some colors and stuff, but you cannot tell the difference, and it, because it's removing information, it makes the PNGs like you can have 100K PNG and turn it into a 5K PNG. Like it's really makes it really light if you have images. So that's like tooling out there that really helps you with that. Another thing, when you use the performance tab in Google Chrome, that one will tell you also. I mean, there's another one we're going to talk later, but that one will show you problematic scripts too, or long running tasks and where they're coming from, so you can identify also where your application is struggling. But yeah, cool. So this one we just
yeah,
talked about is loading, right? Loading. That was the first core, the core web vital we talked about, right? Like loading. What were you gonna say, Jared?
I was going to just add one quick note here. In addition, so the last thing I just thought about here is the other thing that can be very large on your website is a GIF. GIFs are known for being incredibly oversized and large. I would avoid using them on your website, but if you do use them on your website, there's a little trick that most image hosting sites do, which is that they convert the GIF to an MP4, which reduces its size by a significant magnitude. So if you are going to use a GIF, make sure that it's converted to MP4 or something like that. That was just my last bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say in 2021, don't use GIFs. Just use PNGs if you need transparency. If you need some sort of animation, you can still use a PNG and then animate it when the page is ready and the user already got the interactivity. Or use an MP4 video. But remember, videos are more resource intensive. So you might want just to have some PNG placeholder or back placeholder while everything loads. But yeah, cool. So remember, okay, so we just covered loading, right? So that was the first metric. So, Jared, what's the next metric we're gonna cover now?
So the next metric is interactivity, and it's measured in this unit called the first input delay. And as far as like what's good and what's not, so it's going to be good if it's 100 milliseconds or less, and then between 100 milliseconds and 300 milliseconds, it's considered to needs improvement, and then anything above 300 milliseconds is just considered poor. So and again, this has to do with when the user first goes to the page and they want to go click on something. And many users are pretty fast. As soon as a page loads, they're looking to like click on things. And if they don't do anything, that's not as meaningful. So yeah, Juan, let's get into it.
Yeah, so interactivity is important. Have you ever like visited a site and then they just start like maybe tapping on things and nothing happens and you think that it's frozen, right? And we're so impatient these days. So yeah, the first input delay, this one like it has to do a lot with when you have event listeners on your application. It's how fast, right? How fast your event listeners react to the anything that they has to do with user input. So when we talk about input delay, we're just talking about like anything the user interacts with. Let's say the user clicks a link or the user types, maybe opens a text box and how soon we can start typing things, like anything the user can interact with on the page. But those measurements that Jared just mentioned, like just to keep to be safe here, like it doesn't mean like your page has to react to it and do the next action within 100 milliseconds. For example, let's say I click a link and I want to navigate to the next page. It doesn't mean that it has to just navigate and render under 100 milliseconds because that's unrealistic. If that page has to, the new page has to make an API request, it's going to take more than 100 milliseconds, right? Because there's chattiness and then the network payload, then it has to render and process everything. So it just means like how soon your event listener is going to start and initiate that request to then navigate to the page. So that's very important, and that has to do a lot with the optimized usage of idle time. And idle time just means like when the user is not doing anything, is your scripts doing something, right? And if you have a lot of scripts running and then the user tries to interact with something, and let's say you're still running a lot of scripts, then it's not gonna your event listener is not gonna trigger right away because it's you're not optimizing that idle time, and then that's when you're gonna have problems. So for example, let's say you set a lot of timers and set timeout to check maybe some metric or something you want to show in your site. Maybe every second you're checking for something. That's going to start affecting that. So that's very important about these second core metric, right? The interactivity, the core vital, and the first input delay.
Yeah, no, really, it's a really important thing to consider. And many of the things that we had mentioned for the last aspect of the core web vitals actually applies to this as well. So it's highly tied to the single threaded nature of JavaScript and the need to, again, basically essentially limit or delay as much of your scripts as possible until after this interactivity is met. And it's also important to consider any sort of blocking resources that are also going to be, limiting this interactivity.
And something important is like you don't have to limit yourself just to the first user action, but pretty much any action the user performs on your site at any given time during the life of the page or the web app, you have to your event listener has to be triggered or react to it within 100 milliseconds. Anything more than more longer than that is gonna feel like it's sluggish, it's slow side, is not responsive. Okay, especially when you have low end devices. Remember, not everybody has the latest iPhone or the latest Android phone, right? Think always about your users. So, Jared, I'm going to go ahead and share here our Twitters. So,
Yeah, everybody can find me at twitter.com/Jared Potter. That's JaredPotter. Feel free to follow me and, tweet at me, ask me a question, tell me what you're working on.
yeah, and you can find me also twitter.com/JUANLIZARAZOG. and I know it's hard. So we have links to whatever platform you're listening this on or watching this on. We have links to our Twitters, and this is so then you can ask questions. You can, we can engage. We can talk about these things. It's like really fun topics and really fun things we talked about. So follow us on Twitter. Follow us on whatever platform you're watching this on or you're listening this on, and then we'll so you can stay in touch. You can see when we post new content. So yeah, and subscribe or to the podcast or to whatever platform you're. I mean, we're in so many platforms that it's so hard to keep track of. But yeah. So okay, perfect. So now let's talk about the third core metric, Jared, the core web vital. So then we can cover maybe some tooling and some other tips and tricks, and then we can wrap it up. So the third one, so we covered the first one, which is it covers the loading aspect. The second one is the interactivity aspect, right? So what's the third one? What is it? What it covers? What's like that
Yeah.
vital?
The third vital is visual stability. And this is measured in a unit called the cumulative layout shift. And as and this kind of has to just do with, when different elements are loading on the screen and they're, kind of pushing each other around or moving around and jumping around. It's just not a very good experience. As far as what you expect it to be, you want this unit to be zero point 0.1 or less, this cumulative layout shift. So
And
let's get into it, Juan.
yeah, and so remember, like, so you said this has to do with the visual stability. So have you ever visited like an article and you see that, like, to say, like, the text starts loading, it starts loading, and you start reading the text, and then as you start reading, then an image loaded on top and push the text down, right? And then you're kind of like, oh, where was my text? I was reading already, and then you start reading, and then the CSS loads, and now it appears to the right because there's a sidebar, right? That's a really horrible experience. So you want to do things like what Jared mentioned earlier, like optimize the critical CSS, right? Just load the CSS for what the user sees first, right? Some other tips for avoiding that is like provide a specific or at least a mean height or a mean width to your images, or width and height. If you know, like, it's not a responsive image, at least provide a minimum height or minimum width, so then it occupies space before it loads. Because this is what happens when you request an image and it doesn't have dimensions, the tag, the img tag, then the browser has to download the full image to then resize the image so it just fits there. But the problem with that is that triggers a layout paint, right? So that also affects, or it can create other issues, right? You can skip frames. It can and it provides you that bad experience. So when it comes to visual stability, Jared, we think about the elements that are not stable, those elements that move around and shift around. You mentioned that is cumulative. So cumulative means that the that the life of the page. Like if you visit the site and you never refresh, or you visit the web app, then and you're there in a session for an hour. This is cumulative. It's not like, oh, you just jump once and then the next one is a separate one. No, it starts adding up, and the whole life of the page, like, it shouldn't like go over zero point 0.1 to be this ideal metric. So talking about that metric, Jared, so if we go into detail, like, what is this zero point 0.1? So there's like this is calculated using two pieces. So it's super complicated to calculate. I mean, you can go ahead and read a lot about it, but like high level, we have what is called the impact fraction and the distance fraction. And if you're curious about that, go and research everything you can, play with the formula so you can calculate that. But it just really means that the stable elements that move around, right? So the impact fraction is about how they impact the viewport, what you're seeing, right? How it impacts that, and the distance fraction, how they move inside that viewport, right? So then there's this calculation you do, you multiply those two, and that's how you get the zero point 0.1. Usually how it works is like, let's say you get 0.02, but then there's another shift, then you add to it, you add to it, you add to it. But of course, there's tools that do this for you using some APIs, and then you can get this calculated for you. But it's good to understand that part. Long story short, jumping content around is a bad experience. Nobody wants that. Okay. So yeah, that's everything I have to say about it, Jared. Before we jump into tooling, is there anything you want to add to this? Some tips maybe?
Yeah, a few little bits. So, I mean, the ways that you can counter a lot of these things, comes down to being able to set the dimensions on certain elements, if you can. So, for example, the images are one of the culprits that causes content to be jumped around, but also any sort of like embeds or iframes, right? This is pretty much every single ad on the internet. Also can cause things to jump around. But if you are able to, again, know the static height and width of these elements, then you can account for that and prevent the content from jumping around. So right, on that article example, you'll see some text, then you'll see a blank spot, but it's taking up the height of the ad, and then down below it, you're gonna then have the other piece of text. But it's nice because you see the structure of all the elements, and they're there. You're not having to worry about them jumping around.
Perfect. So let's share now, Jared, our secrets. How do we like make our sites be super fast and like let's share our secrets. So the first secret, I'm gonna share one, you're gonna share one, and until we run out of secrets, okay? So the first one is like visit the site called web.dev. So it's web.dev. This is a site maintained by Google, and they have a lot of like, I mean, not just the core web vitals, but it has like a lot of information of everything a front engineer should know, and everybody working with web dev, like with web development. If you work on that, like you see that site and bookmarked it, and there's so much content. That's like one of my secrets to like how I become the best engineer on the team, right? So that's the first one I want to share. So, Jared,
Yeah, no, that's
secrets,
a really good
tools,
one.
share something.
I don't know how many actual secrets I have that we haven't already touched on a little bit, but I'll reemphasize the importance of being able to use the Chrome Dev Tools, and specifically using the Lighthouse tool when you're doing development to ensure that your content is being done properly. Now, one little caveat I'll say, and this kind of has to do with everything that we're talking about today, is all of these things have to do with optimization. And optimization is an important thing. It's a crucial thing, but it takes place after the primary task is complete, right? So if you're building some sort of functionality into your site, or you need to make it have a certain visual appeal or user experience, right? That's going to be the primary aspect. But if you're looking to be able to take a site that you've built and you're really ready to take it to the next level, right, and learn some of these technologies and these skills with optimization, I definitely encourage you doing that.
Yeah, and something important when you're like, yeah, when you don't do it too early, don't early optimize, don't aim to get 100% on every score, or like meet like 0.1 and 100 million. Like, I mean, that's the end goal, but like if you don't get that quite at the beginning, don't worry about it. It's really hard. If Lighthouse does not report 100% on everything, don't worry about it. Most sites don't have 100% on everything. Very important when you run these tools, run it with a guest user in your browser, or maybe in incognito mode, because when you have extensions, those extensions affect the performance of your site and your measurements. So if you have a lot of Chrome extensions, they're going to affect that. So keep that in mind. Use a separate user so you get real numbers about what you're building. Performance tab, right? And the Lighthouse tab. And Lighthouse is really cool because it provides you with feedback, like a specific step, like, hey, remove these, change these, and that will make your site faster. So that will help you. And the last one I want to share that is related to that, since you mentioned it, Jared, is Page Insights. So Page Speed Insights is a website by Google that you can just visit, and you enter your URL. So this means it's already published. So if you have this already out there, you use Page Speed Insights. If you don't have it out there, then just use the Chrome Dev Tools, the Lighthouse tab, the Performance tab, profile your application, check the memory tab. So you see also your objects and all that stuff. So you see like your scripting time, how you can optimize that. But that's really like everything that's gonna like help you with these. And there's tools that are gonna, if you read that the web.dev site, there's a lot of tools there that are gonna guide you better on how to apply the core web vitals. We just mentioned high level, we're throwing a lot of content at you so you can become the best engineer on your team. But yeah, that's everything I have to say, Jared. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Nope, I think we gave everybody a lot today, so it's good good content to get researching on and get practiced on.
Perfect. So yeah, so just remember loading, interactivity, and visual stability, and the metrics and the different things and the units and the tooling for those. So perfect. So thank you so much for joining us today in this episode of Dev Bootcamp Live, where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job and become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.